chapter 1, like I said, we're going to be in Jonah. And I'll give you a second to get there because I'll tell you what, those minor prophets, I think they changed places in the middle of the night. So we're just going to look at the first 3 verses this morning. It says, the word of the Lord came to Jonah, son of Amittai. Go to the great city of Nineveh and preach against it, because its wickedness has come up before me. But Jonah ran away from the Lord and headed for Tarsus. He went down to Joppa, where he found a ship bound for that port. After paying the fare, he went aboard and sailed for Tarsus to flee from the Lord. Like I said, a couple weeks ago, we're going to be in Jonah for the next few weeks. I don't necessarily know how long this series is going to be. I've heard Jonah, it's kind of a short book. I've heard Jonah preach through all in one message. And there were some really great messages when I've heard it done like that. You can certainly preach through the whole thing in one message. But as I've been reading and studying Jonah these past couple weeks, I've been seeing there are so many things here for us. So many things that even though this book was written 25, 26, 2,700 years ago, this stuff is so relevant to us today. There are so many modern day applications that we see in this book. So I don't necessarily know how long it's going to be. It's not going to be that long. It's not going to be like studying Romans on Wednesday night. But I just want God to lead and direct us. Now, I was telling Becky the other day, I said, I want the series of this to be Man on the Run. That's what I want the name to be. But I Googled it, and you know that just about every other pastor out there has preached a sermon series on Jonah and titled it Man on the Run. I had to be original. So this is going to be called The Running Man instead. Yeah. It's just as good, right? Well, there's a point to that. It's through the whole book, this is what Jonah's doing. He's running. He's running through the whole book. And you might say, oh, wait a second, he just runs in the beginning, and then there's the storm, the fish, it's all good then. It might seem that way. But even when it seems like Jonah's kind of feigning obedience, he's still running. And there's a lot of important lessons there for us because of that. See, when we look at Jonah, we see a story of very improbable and amazing events. I didn't say impossible. I said improbable. This is the kind of stuff that you don't see happen every day. You have this great big storm that just comes out of nowhere. You have this giant fish that swallows Jonah. And then you have Jonah's rescue. And then there's that big vine at the end of the story. I don't want to give it all away. If you've never read it, no, I'm kidding. If you've never read it, go read it. But there's all this stuff that happens that is so improbable. And when we read all this, we get the idea that whoever wrote this book, they wanted us to key in on these things. These are very important events that are happening. And it would be a horrible shame if we were to read through this short book and take in these accounts of these amazing events happening and just merely take it as any other story. It would be a horrible shame for us to read the book and say, oh, that was some really wild stuff that happened back then. Friends, there's some crazy stuff that happens in this book, and spoiler alert, the fish isn't the biggest thing. But the big thing here is not the events. It's who the events are pointing to. There's a writer, G. Campbell Morgan, and he wrote about Jonah, and he says, Men have been looking so hard at that great fish that they have failed to see the great God. It's like the author is telling us through these details in this story what God's nature and his heart is really all about. And at the same time, if we read it with sensitivity, we're going to see that it's not just showing us what our God's all about, it's showing us what we as his people ought to be all about. Amen? So in this passage that we read, this is the beginning of the book, and it starts out pretty much like every other prophetic book would start out in the Old Testament. A word of the Lord, it comes to a prophet. But that's where the similarities end with the other Old Testament prophets. You see, the story of Jonah is very different. And first of all, it's different because it's a story. You look at the other Old Testament prophets, except for maybe Daniel. You look at Jeremiah, Isaiah, Obadiah, Micah, all of these different Old Testament books. They're not stories. Instead, God sends a message to the prophet, and the prophet then delivers the message to the people. And the book that we have is the written account of that message. We don't really get that in Jonah. Jonah is not about the message, it's about the story of Jonah delivering the message, or should I say his reluctance to deliver the message. And also we find that unlike the other prophets in the Old Testament, this prophetic story is not one that we want to model our lives after. Jonah serves kind of like he's like the anti-hero. You know what I mean? It reminds me of a picture I saw of a sinking ship. If you can't read the caption up there, it says, "It could be that the purpose of your life is only to serve as a warning to others." And that's kind of Jonah. The purpose of Jonah is to kind of serve as the guy who we don't want to be like. So let's make sure that we get that. Jonah is not a good example of what it looks like to follow the Lord. It reminds me of a movie that my kids like to watch called Angry Birds. Maybe some of your kids or grandkids have tortured you in the same way as maybe you have watched Angry Birds. But if you haven't, I'll share with you that there are these birds, and they have this hero that none of them have ever met named Mighty Eagle. And he back in the day, he did these awesome things, but nobody's ever met him. He's just kind of this person that they revere and they talk about. And then one day, the characters, they get into a bind, and they need to go search for help. So they say, "Let's go find Mighty Eagle and ask for his help." But when they find him, they see that Mighty Eagle has kind of let himself go, and he's not very mighty anymore. Mighty Eagle kind of he skated on the shirt tails of his past success, and now he's just kind of not very mighty. He's just Eagle. And that really relates to Jonah. I know it doesn't seem like what we read here relates to that illustration, but that's exactly what's happened with this story of Jonah. And this is so tragic. Really, I would say Jonah is a tragedy. See, it's tragic anytime someone refuses to follow God. But when we consider who Jonah is, and we think about his past, we think about his heritage, where he came from, it is even more heartbreaking. You see, we've seen Jonah before. Did you know that? We've seen Jonah in the Old Testament before. He was in 2 Kings chapter 14. I know that you all probably were reading that in your devotions early this morning when you got up. 2 Kings chapter 14. He gets an honorable mention there. In that passage, the writer of Kings is talking about the second king, Jeroboam. And Jeroboam was an evil king, and it says there in verses 24 and 25, he did evil in the eyes of the Lord and did not turn away from any of the sins of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, who was the first king Jeroboam, which he had caused Israel to commit. He was the one who restored the boundaries of Israel from Lebo Hamath to the Dead Sea, in accordance with the word of the Lord, the God of Israel, spoken through his servant Jonah, son of Amittai, the prophet from Gath-Hepher. Might not seem like a big deal, but that actually really is a big deal to us in our reading of Jonah. See, Jonah was a part of a group of prophets that existed back then. They were kind of like the royal court of prophets. There would have been this what we could think of as a school of prophets. It was quite a large band of fellows who served as the spiritual advisors to the king. Now, this was a lot more than what we would think of as spiritual advisors. They didn't just pray for the king. They didn't just give him spiritual advice. But these prophets operated. God called them out to actually speak for God and to bring the people, including the king, under the authority of the word of God. That's a pretty big function. That is a pretty huge thing. So as a member of the school of prophets, Jonah had not only a calling, a very special calling, but he had a destiny. He had a purpose. His purpose in life was to be used by God to speak God's words to the people in order to bring them closer to God. So that's what I mean when I say this is heartbreaking. Whenever someone runs away from their purpose, their God-called, God-ordained function in this world, the whole reason that they are on this earth, that is tragic. It is heartbreaking. Did you know that each one of you has a purpose? I really believe that. And I don't mean in the corporate common sense as us as the human race, but I mean you specifically as persons. Each one of you has a purpose, a special one. Kids, you've got a purpose. Maybe God's calling one of you into ministry of some sort. God's calling all of us into ministry. We're going to talk more about that in the coming weeks, what it means that each one of us is called to a specific personal purpose. But for the rest of this message, I want to talk about our common purpose, the purpose of us as a church, the way we're called out as a church. See, back to Jonah's early ministry, even though the king of Israel was wicked at the time, what does it say happened in 2 Kings? God gave Jonah a word, and that word helped Israel. So, think about that. Jonah had some success then. In fact, Jonah would have enjoyed an amazing privilege in that society. You know, for the prophets whose word really came to be, those guys were like the rock stars in that society. Man, they were like the celebrities. For a prophet in the school of prophets who advised the king, that's a special thing. But when your word really comes to be, that means, whoa, that prophet's legitimate. God is speaking through that person. They kind of become a celebrity, so to speak. In fact, when we consider all of the hundreds of prophets who had existed throughout the times and who had served for all those hundreds of years in the Old Testament times, and we only get to hear about a couple of them by name in the Old Testament. And here, Jonah is one of them. He gets this honorable mention. So that shows to us that he was somebody of standing and success in that community. Now, church, past success can sometimes be the greatest enemy to us being fruitful in the present. Can I get an amen? Past success can sometimes be one of the greatest enemies to us being fruitful in the present. We can get these ideas sometimes when we're being called out by God to go into directions that are uncomfortable. That because I've done well in the past, I can get kind of this entitlement mentality. And I've seen this so many times in churches throughout the years. It's so frustrating that we say things, and maybe we're not saying it with our actual words, but our actions are definitely saying these things. Hey, I paid my dues. You heard that before? Or maybe even more dangerous is, God, what you're calling me to do gets in the way of my comfort and what I see as best. Church, make no mistake, past obedience is no substitute for present obedience. Amen. We can see so many parallels here with Jonah's actions in these first 3 verses in our modern day church. The church in America in particular. You see, in the New Testament, you know the Greek word that the writers use for the word church? It's ekklesia. And you know what that word means? It means the called out ones. If we were to translate it literally, the church means the called out ones. Those who are called out of darkness and into light. Those who are called out for a purpose. You see, God doesn't need a school of prophets anymore, a school of specific men that he has to advise a king. His presence is here amongst me and you. We are serving that function now. So that means, church, we must move with God. If it's one thing that this passage here in Jonah is telling us, is that God is a missionary God who's on the move. We're going to talk a lot more about the significance next week of it and the weeks to come of what it would mean that God would send Jonah to Nineveh of all places. But let's just suffice it to say, for right now, it was a place Jonah didn't want to go, was it? It's kind of obvious because he gets in the ship and he heads in the opposite direction. He tries to actually flee from the presence of the Lord. And man, I wonder how often we do that same exact thing. It's a tragedy when Jonah forsakes his purpose. And it is a tragedy every time God calls his church to go in a direction and we dig in our heels. Because our God is still a missionary God. And he's still on the move. He is moving to take his light into the places of darkness in this messed up world. And he's calling us to be with him. Amen? And if we're not moving with him, if we are not moving with him, we might as well just be going in the opposite direction. So many folks in church today, their concern is not moving with God. Their concern is about preserving things to be the way that keeps them comfortable. And we look around at what's going on in our country and saying we're turning so far from God, it's turning into Nineveh. But we got to realize that we're keeping our doors so closed. We're keeping them so small for people to get through. Not the literal physical doors, but the ones that we can't see. Now, it might sound like my use of the word preservation means I'm singling out the older generation. And young people, I'm not. See, I was a youth pastor for 12 years. I know full well that some of the biggest objectors to change are teenagers. So this is for everybody. This message is for everybody. in my conversations over the years with the growing population of people that are feeling more and more alienated from church, and they're alienated from church for silly things, silly cultural things, not stuff that has to do with Jesus or the gospel. But in my conversations, it's become more and more clear that we have to denounce the spirit of Jonah that rests in our hearts. That spirit that would cling to things that we've done in the past, whether it be the recent past or the distant past, those things that we use as an excuse to cling to our comfort. Rather, we need to move with our God, our missionary God, into those places that maybe make us uncomfortable. Move with our God into places where His light is really needed. Those dark places that get us out of our safety and our comfort zone. To move to those places of uncharted territory in our communities where we say, we've never done it that way before. Church, God is still on the move. He has come to seek and save that which was lost.
Amen.
Are we going to move with Him? May we be a church who is faithful to move with Him. I want to have a time for us to reflect on these things. And Sheena, if it's okay, I want to do this in quiet. Usually it's nice to have a little piano, but I don't know, something this morning says we need to just sit in the quiet and speak to the Lord for a moment. Because like I said, this message is for all of us. Because I will admit, it speaks to me as well. None of us like to be uncomfortable. Amen? But may we be faithful in moving with our missionary God.